A year after I buried my wife, I finally found the courage to open the door to her sewing room. I hired a local contractor to fix a small water stain near the baseboards. I was pulling into the hardware store parking lot when my phone rang. The contractor's voice was shaking. He told me to come home immediately, but to come alone. He refused to explain over the phone. When I walked into that room and saw what he had pulled from inside the walls of my own house, my entire reality shattered. Before I reveal the contents of that hidden safe, let me know where you are listening from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you believe the deepest betrayals always come from those closest to you. I am Stephen, 64 years old and a retired agricultural engineer. For 40 years, I worked the soil and maintained our 50-acre property in upstate New York. It was a quiet life built on hard work and predictability. But that Tuesday morning, the predictability evaporated forever. The drive from the hardware store back to the farmhouse usually took 10 minutes. It felt like an absolute eternity. I kept replaying Pete's frantic phone call in my head. Pete was a seasoned repairman, a guy who had seen every kind of foundational rot and electrical disaster in the county. He was not the type to panic. Yet his voice had possessed a raw edge of genuine fear. I parked my truck near the porch. The house was dead silent. I walked through the kitchen, my heavy boots echoing on the hardwood floor. I headed toward the back hallway toward Diane's sewing room. I had kept it locked since her funeral, unable to face the ghost of her presence. Now the door was wide open. Pete was sitting flat on the floor, his back pressed against the opposite wall. His breathing was shallow. He had a drywall saw resting near his knee, covered in white dust. I looked at the wall he had been working on. He had not just cut out the water-damaged section near the baseboard. He had ripped out a massive 4x4 square of drywall between the wooden studs. I stepped closer, my brow furrowing in confusion. Houses built in the late 70s did not have architectural voids like this. Someone had intentionally framed out a hidden cavity, insulated it with soundproofing foam, and wired it directly into the main electrical breaker. Nestled inside this dark secret space sat a high-capacity commercial-grade network router. Its green indicator lights blinked rhythmically, feeding off a hardwired power supply that bypassed the room's standard switches. This was not a forgotten relic from a previous owner. The dust on the thick black cables was minimal. The router model was brand new. It was actively transmitting massive amounts of data from inside my home. My eyes moved downward. Resting on the bottom plate of the wall framing directly beneath the blinking router was a heavy steel lockbox. It was bolted directly into the foundation beam with heavy-duty lag screws. Pete finally looked up at me. He did not say a single word. He just slowly lifted his hand and offered me his heavy steel crowbar. I took it, the cold metal grounding me for a fraction of a second. I knelt in the drywall dust. I wedged the flattened edge of the crowbar under the thick metal latch of the lockbox. I threw my entire weight into the lever. The metal screws groaned against the wood. The steel shrieked against steel. With a sharp, violent crack, the locking mechanism snapped and the heavy lid sprang open. My heart hammered against my ribs. I reached inside the dark metal cavity. My fingers brushed against a thick stack of crisp paper and a small, hard plastic cylinder. I pulled them both out into the light of the room. First, I looked at the plastic cylinder. It was a standard orange prescription bottle. The printed label bore my name and the name of the pharmacy downtown. It indicated my standard daily blood pressure medication, taking 20 milligrams every morning. I took this medication every single day without fail. I had done so for 5 years. The pills were always small, chalky, and white. I popped the white plastic cap off and poured a few into my calloused palm. The pills staring back at me were large, glossy, and bright yellow. They were completely unrecognizable. My throat went entirely dry as a terrifying realization washed over me. For the past 6 months, I had been experiencing severe bouts of dizziness, memory fog, and unexplainable lethargy. My daughter-in-law, Megan, had insisted on organizing my weekly pill boxes, claiming I was becoming too forgetful to manage it myself. I dropped the yellow pills back into the bottle and set it gently on the floor. My hands began to tremble as I unfolded the thick stack of legal documents. The heavy watermark of the state court system was embossed on the top corner of the paper. The bold, capitalized letters of the header burned into my vision. Petition for declaration of mental incompetence and emergency conservatorship. I scanned the dense legal jargon, my mind struggling to process the absolute cruelty of the words printed on the page. The document detailed a complete and irreversible cognitive decline. It outlined a series of fabricated incidents where I supposedly wandered off the property or left the stove burning. It requested the immediate stripping of all my financial, medical, and legal rights. It explicitly demanded that control of my pension, my bank accounts, and the deed to my 50-acre farm be transferred immediately to the petitioner. I turned to the very last page. There, signed in sharp blue ink and notarized by a local official, was the petitioner's signature. It belonged to my only son, Matthew, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the boy whose college tuition I had paid for by working double shifts for 10 years. He had not just signed a document. He had orchestrated a systematic chemical assault on my brain to manufacture the symptoms of dementia. He had installed a hidden network router to monitor my decline through cameras I had not yet found. He had built a physical trap inside the walls of his dead mother's sanctuary. I looked back at Pete, who was still staring at me in horrified silence. I did not scream. I did not throw the lockbox across the room. I carefully folded the forged legal documents and placed them in my chest pocket. I picked up the bottle of yellow poison and slipped it into my jeans. The sorrow evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, mechanical clarity. Matthew wanted to treat me like an expired resource. He was about to learn that I was the architect of this family, and I knew exactly how to demolish the foundation he was standing on. I did not call the police. The urge to pick up the phone and dial the authorities was overwhelming, but I forced myself to breathe. Calling the police now would be a mistake. It would become a messy domestic dispute, a case of an allegedly confused old man making wild accusations against his loving family. Matthew had the forged documents. He had the doctor on his side. I only had a broken lockbox and a theory. I needed absolute, undeniable proof. I thanked Pete, the repairman, paid him in cash, and told him to keep quiet about everything he had seen. Pete nodded and quickly drove away, eager to be separated from my family nightmare. I was alone in the quiet house. I took the commercial router from the wall cavity and carried it to my study. My hands were perfectly steady now. The yellow pills were no longer clouding my system. I found the tiny memory card slot on the side of the device. I popped out the small black chip and slid it directly into the side port of my laptop. A folder instantly appeared on my screen holding hundreds of high-definition video files. They were organized by date and time. I opened the main viewing application. My screen split into a grid of 12 different camera feeds. A cold shiver ran down my spine. The cameras covered every single inch of my home except for the bathrooms. There was a wide-angle view of the kitchen, a direct shot of my living room armchair, the front porch, the back deck, and even a camera pointed squarely at my bed. I had been living inside a surveillance state for months, entirely unaware. Every moment of confusion, every stumble, every time I rubbed my temples trying to clear the chemically induced fog had been recorded and catalogued. I scrolled down the list of files looking for a specific date. Last Tuesday. That was the day I had nearly burned the farmhouse down. It was the day the final piece of my confidence had crumbled. I clicked on a file time-stamped at 2 in the morning. The video player opened, showing a black and white night vision feed of my kitchen. The house was pitch black, but the infrared camera illuminated everything in a sharp, ghostly glow. The digital clock in the corner of the video ticked forward. At exactly 10 minutes past 2, the deadbolt on the back door slowly turned. Matthew stepped into the frame. My own son, wearing a dark jacket and holding a spare key I did not know he possessed. He moved with practiced ease. He did not look around. He did not hesitate. He walked straight to the gas stove. I watched the screen in absolute horror as Matthew reached out and turned the front right burner dial. He did not ignite the flame. He just opened the valve, allowing raw gas to silently flood my kitchen. He then turned his attention to the kitchen island. My car keys were resting exactly where I always left them, next to the fruit bowl. Matthew picked them up, walked over to the stainless steel refrigerator, and opened the bottom freezer drawer. He tossed my keys behind a frozen bag of vegetables. He closed the drawer, walked back out the rear door, and locked it behind him. The entire intrusion took less than 2 minutes. I paused the video. The silence in my study was deafening. I felt a physical pain in my chest, not from a failing heart, but from a broken soul. I clicked on the next file, time-stamped 5 hours later at 7 in the morning. This feed was in full color, bathed in the early morning sunlight. My daughter-in-law Megan unlocked the front door and walked in for her regular morning visit. She carried a basket of fresh muffins. I watched myself walk into the kitchen frame. I looked exhausted, wearing my old bathrobe, rubbing my eyes. Megan immediately dropped the basket of muffins. She covered her mouth with both hands and began to act her part perfectly. Even without audio, I remembered exactly what she had yelled. She asked what I had done. She ran to the stove and violently twisted the dial off. She threw open the kitchen windows, waving a dish towel in the air to clear the gas. I watched my recorded self standing there, completely bewildered. I had no memory of touching the stove. I had apologized to her profusely. I had felt completely useless, entirely terrified of my own failing mind. The video then showed Megan asking me to sit down. She asked me where my car keys were so she could move my truck away from the house just in case. I watched myself search the counters, search the living room, check my pockets. I could not find them. Megan finally opened the freezer and pulled them out, holding them up like a tragic trophy. She had looked at me with tears in her eyes and told me my dementia was progressing too fast. She said I was becoming a severe danger to myself and that she and Matthew were deeply worried. I closed the laptop. The darkness of their plan was absolute. My cognitive decline was not a medical tragedy. It was a carefully choreographed stage play. Every symptom I displayed was either chemically induced by the pills or physically staged by their late-night intrusions. They were actively gaslighting me, building a bulletproof legal case to strip away my independence. They needed the farm, and they needed me declared incompetent to get it quickly. The sadness I felt a few minutes ago vanished. It evaporated into thin air, leaving behind something much more potent. It left behind a cold, calculated anger. They had underestimated the man they were dealing with. I had spent 40 years engineering complex agricultural systems, calculating yields, and preparing for every possible environmental disaster. I knew how to build things, and I knew how to dismantle them. Matthew and Megan thought they were playing a game of checkers with a confused old man. They did not realize they had just forced me into a game of chess, and I now had access to all their pieces. I stood up from my desk. I left the laptop open. The first phase of their plan had been to convince me I was crazy. The second phase was clearly the legal conservatorship. They wanted control of my assets before I could contest anything. I reached into my pocket and felt the forged legal documents Pete had helped me uncover. I needed to move fast, and I needed to move silently. If I confronted them now, they would deny everything and destroy the evidence. I had to let them believe their plan was still working. I had to let them think they were winning right up until the moment I dropped the floor out from under them. I walked out of the study and headed for the garage. It was time to find out exactly what they were planning to do with my land. I secured the heavy deadbolt on my study door, making sure the laptop was hidden and the surveillance router was placed exactly back in its wall cavity. I pocketed the plastic bottle of yellow pills. I needed to know exactly what kind of weapon my own son was using against me. I bypassed the local medical clinic entirely. The medical establishment in our small town was far too tightly knit. Dr. Keller was already bought and paid for by my family, and I could not risk anyone tipping off Matthew that I was asking questions. I climbed into the cab of my rusted pickup truck and drove 30 miles east to a neighboring county. The drive gave me time to process the sheer scale of the betrayal. The familiar landscape of upstate New York rolled past my window, but I barely registered the green fields or the distant mountains. I had spent my entire adult life protecting my family, providing for them and building a legacy on that 50-acre farm. Now that very legacy was the primary motive for my own slow, methodical execution. I found an independent toxicology laboratory nestled deep inside a bleak industrial park. It was a sterile cinder block building devoid of any warmth or welcoming decor. That was exactly what I needed. I needed pure, objective science without any friendly neighborhood small talk. I walked up to the thick glass partition and placed the plastic pill bottle on the stainless steel counter. The technician was a young woman with tired eyes. She automatically asked for my insurance card and a referring physician's order. I shook my head slowly. I pulled 4 crisp $100 bills from my leather wallet and slid them under the glass slot. I told her I needed a rush chemical analysis on the exact contents of that bottle, and I needed my identity to remain completely anonymous. Cash has a universal language that cuts through bureaucratic red tape. She took the money, printed a generic barcode, slapped it on the side of the bottle, and told me to wait in the lobby. The 2 hours I spent sitting in that rigid plastic waiting room chair were the longest of my entire life. I watched the red second hand of the wall clock tick away, plotting my exact next steps. Finally, the technician returned holding a thin manila folder. She handed it to me with a strange look that was a mixture of professional detachment and quiet, genuine concern. I did not open it in front of her. I took the folder out to the cab of my truck, locking the doors, before sliding my finger under the paper flap. The chemical name was printed in bold black letters across the top of the laboratory report. Quetiapine. I pulled out my phone and searched the National Medical Database. The results hit me harder than a physical blow to the chest. It was a heavy-duty antipsychotic medication. It was typically prescribed for patients suffering from severe schizophrenia or extreme bipolar disorder. In elderly patients, however, it carried a severe black box warning from the federal government. It was scientifically known to induce extreme lethargy, severe short-term memory loss, profound mental confusion, and aggressive physical tremors. I dropped my phone onto the passenger seat as the puzzle pieces snapped together with horrifying precision. For the last 6 months, my daughter-in-law Megan had insisted on coming over every Sunday afternoon. She would bring a freshly baked pie or a warm casserole, playing the role of the incredibly devoted caregiver to perfection. She would sit at my kitchen table and carefully sort my weekly medication into those little plastic daily organizers. She always told me she just wanted to help take the burden off my shoulders. She would hold my hand and say my memory was slipping, and she wanted to make sure I stayed perfectly healthy. Every Sunday, she sat at the table I bought in the house I built and methodically counted out the poison that was meant to erase my mind. She smiled affectionately at me while she handed me the very chemical that was systematically destroying my life. The primal urge to start the engine drive straight to their immaculate suburban home and kick their front door off its hinges surged through my veins. I wanted to throw that manila folder directly in Matthew's face. I wanted to see the color drain from Megan's perfectly powdered cheeks when she realized I knew absolutely everything. But my decades of engineering instincts kicked in, overriding the blinding anger. If I confronted them now, they would simply pivot their strategy. They would claim a tragic pharmacy error. They would rush the conservatorship through an emergency judge before I could gather enough concrete evidence to stop them permanently. They currently held the high ground. I had to let them keep thinking they were winning. I had to remain the confused, helpless old man they had successfully engineered me to be. I started the truck and drove away from the industrial park. I did not head home. I drove toward the affluent commercial district of the city and found a high-end, holistic wellness pharmacy. I walked the quiet aisles until I found exactly what my plan required. I purchased a large bottle of empty vegetarian gelatin capsules. They were the exact same oval size and shape as the quetiapine pills. I also bought a large bottle of pure powdered vitamin C. It was a pale yellowish powder that perfectly matched the specific hue of the antipsychotic medication. I paid in cash once again, leaving no digital paper trail, and drove back to the quiet isolation of my farm. I sat down at my kitchen table, the exact spot where Megan executed her weekly betrayal. I spread a clean white dish towel over the wood. I opened the bottle of quetiapine and dumped every single yellow pill into a heavy plastic storage bag. I then took my heavy metal hammer from my garage toolbox and crushed them. I crushed them until they were nothing but a fine, toxic dust. I walked out to the barn and buried the bag deep inside a 50-gallon barrel of agricultural fertilizer. I went back to the kitchen and began my delicate work. My hands were still shaking slightly from the residual neurological effects of the drug, but my focus was absolute. I carefully separated the empty gelatin capsules. Using a tiny metal measuring spoon, I filled each half with the powdered vitamin C. I snapped them closed one by one. It was tedious work for a man with large, calloused hands, but I did not stop. By the time the sun began to set behind the tree line, I had a full bottle of perfectly replicated pills. They looked completely identical to the poison Megan had been giving me. I took my Sunday pill organizer and replaced every single yellow pill with my harmless vitamin C capsules. I put the plastic organizer back on the kitchen counter exactly where Megan always left it. I poured myself a tall glass of cold water and swallowed my first real blood pressure pill in half a year. I knew the physical withdrawal from the quetiapine over the next few days would be absolutely brutal. My body had grown chemically dependent on the heavy sedative. I knew I would experience severe headaches, constant nausea, and freezing cold sweats. But I welcomed the impending physical pain. The pain meant my central nervous system was finally waking up. The pain meant the thick chemical fog was lifting from my brain. I was taking my mind back. I would let Matthew and Megan continue their carefully choreographed play. I would stumble when they expected me to stumble. I would look at them with vacant, lost eyes when they asked me simple questions. I would let them believe the heavy sedative was quietly erasing my entire existence. They thought they were burying a helpless, fragile old man. They did not realize they had simply planted a seed of absolute ruin. By Friday morning, the brutal physical toll of the withdrawal had finally passed. The agonizing headaches that had kept me awake for 3 straight nights were gone. The freezing sweats that had soaked through my bed sheets had vanished. I stood in my kitchen and poured a cup of black coffee. I lifted the heavy ceramic mug to my lips. My hands were perfectly still. There was no tremor. There was no hesitation. The thick chemical fog that had suffocated my brain for 6 months had completely dissipated, leaving behind a sharp and dangerous clarity. I walked out onto the back porch and took a deep breath of the cold morning air. I felt like a man who had been buried alive and had finally managed to claw his way out of the dirt. I leaned against the wooden railing and looked out over my 50 acres. The morning sun was just beginning to break over the eastern tree line, casting long golden shadows across the fields. Diane and I had bought this property 40 years ago, when it was nothing but overgrown brush and rocky soil. I had cleared the lower pastures with my own 2 hands. I had built the main barn beam by beam. I had planted the oak trees that now towered over the driveway. Every single inch of this farm contained a memory of my life. It was a living, breathing testament to decades of honest labor and unconditional love. Matthew had grown up running through those very fields chasing fireflies and learning how to drive on the old tractor paths. Now he was actively orchestrating my demise to pave over his own childhood. The profound silence of the morning was suddenly shattered by the aggressive crunch of heavy tires on gravel. I watched as a sleek black luxury SUV with heavily tinted windows turned off the main county road. The vehicle completely ignored the heavy iron gate that stood open at the end of the driveway. It rolled right past the large red signs clearly stating that this was private property and absolutely no trespassing was allowed. The vehicle did not stop at the house. It drove directly onto the grass of the lower pasture, crushing the morning dew, and parked near the old irrigation pond. A man stepped out of the driver's side. He looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of the rural landscape. He was wearing a sharp, tailored gray suit and expensive leather shoes that immediately sank into the soft, damp earth. He did not look toward the farmhouse. He did not seek out the owner of the land to ask for permission. He simply pulled a large digital surveying tablet from the passenger seat and began to walk the perimeter of the pond. He held the device up, aiming its camera at the tree line and tapping the screen with practiced efficiency. I set my coffee mug down on the porch railing. My pulse quickened, but I forced my heart rate to slow. I had to remember the script my son had written for me. I was no longer an agricultural engineer with a sharp mind. I was supposed to be a hollow shell of a man rapidly losing his grip on reality. I rolled my shoulders forward, hunching my back to appear smaller and more fragile. I stepped off the porch and began to walk toward the lower pasture. I dragged my heavy leather work boots through the dirt, intentionally scuffing my heels and shuffling my feet. I let my facial muscles completely relax until my jaw hung slightly open. I blinked slowly, forcing a look of absolute vacant confusion into my eyes. I approached the man in the gray suit. He was so absorbed in his digital tablet that he did not even notice me until I was standing less than 10 feet away. He finally looked up. His expression immediately twisted into a mask of deep irritation. He did not greet me. He did not ask if I was the owner of the property. He looked at my worn flannel shirt, my shuffling posture, and my vacant expression, and instantly dismissed me as a confused nuisance. He let out a long, exasperated sigh, as if my mere presence on my own land was a massive inconvenience to his busy schedule. He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick, glossy business card. He stepped forward and shoved it into my hand without making eye contact. I looked down at the card, holding it clumsily with trembling fingers. The logo was embossed in silver ink. It read, Apex Industrial Logistics. I looked up at him, tilting my head to the side and letting out a soft, confused mumble. He rolled his eyes and spoke to me in a slow, incredibly loud voice as if I were both deaf and entirely stupid. "Do not worry, old-timer," he said, waving his hand dismissively toward the farmhouse. "I am just mapping the access roads. We need to figure out how to widen the main entry gate for the heavy concrete trucks. The new distribution center is going to take up this entire lower valley, and we need a clear path to the highway. I forced my hands to shake a little harder, clutching the glossy card. I mumbled again, asking him what he meant by a distribution center. He laughed. It was a short, cruel sound devoid of any real humor. He tapped the screen of his tablet and turned it slightly so I could see the digital blueprint. Overlaid on a satellite image of my farm were massive gray rectangles representing concrete warehouses. The buildings completely swallowed the lower pastures, crushed the main barn, and paved over the garden I had built for Diane. The owner has already signed the preliminary land lease, he said, his tone dripping with corporate arrogance. Matthew Reynolds signed the letter of intent to build on Wednesday. We are breaking ground the very moment the court clears the final title transfer next week. The heavy machinery will be rolling in by Friday. I just stared at the dirt beneath his expensive shoes. The sheer audacity of the plan was breathtaking. Matthew was not just planning to lock me away in a memory care facility. He was actively selling the family farm before I was even legally declared incompetent. He was operating on the absolute assumption that my legal death was nothing more than a minor administrative formality. A preliminary lease from a company like Apex Industrial Logistics meant that massive amounts of money had already changed hands. Corporate real estate developers did not send surveyors out to map private land without a signed contract and a hefty cash advance. Matthew was using my property as collateral before he even had the legal right to do so. I gave the surveyor a blank, empty nod. I turned around and began the slow, shuffling walk back up the hill toward the farmhouse. I kept my head down, playing the part of the defeated, confused old man until I was completely out of his line of sight. The moment I stepped through the back door into the kitchen, the act vanished. My posture straightened completely. I tossed the glossy business card onto the wooden table. The game had just escalated far beyond a simple family betrayal. Matthew and Megan were not just stealing my money. They were committing massive corporate fraud involving millions of dollars. They had built a house of cards on a foundation of forged medical documents and stolen authority. I walked over to the counter and picked up my truck keys. The cold mechanical clarity I had felt when I opened the lockbox returned stronger than ever. The preliminary lease meant there was a ticking clock. I could not wait for them to make the next move. I had to start systematically dismantling their operation right now. The entire legal strategy to take my farm rested on one single piece of paper. It rested on the official diagnosis of severe cognitive decline signed by a licensed medical professional. Without that document, Matthew had absolutely no power. He could not execute the conservatorship, and he certainly could not finalize the sale of the land to Apex Industrial Logistics. I knew exactly who had provided that ammunition. It was time to pay a personal visit to the man who had sold his medical oath for a piece of my stolen legacy. I walked out to the garage and started the engine of my truck. I was heading into town to have a very private conversation with Dr. Keller. I parked my truck behind the sleek, modern building that housed Dr. Keller's private medical practice. The clinic was located in the wealthiest district of the city, a place filled with high-end boutiques and expensive coffee shops. It was a practice built on catering to the affluent, dispensing unnecessary vitamin drips and signing off on whatever medical paperwork the wealthy elite required. I walked through the sliding glass doors into a lobby that looked more like a luxury spa than a medical facility. The air smelled of lavender and expensive cleaning products. A young receptionist with a pristine smile sat behind a curved marble desk. She asked if I had an appointment. I did not break my stride. I ignored her entirely, walking right past the desk and heading straight down the carpeted hallway toward the private offices. She called out behind me, her voice rising in panic, but I kept moving. I knew exactly which office belonged to the head of the clinic. I reached the heavy mahogany door with Keller's name engraved on a polished brass plaque. I pushed it open without knocking and stepped inside. Dr. Keller was sitting behind a massive glass desk, tapping away on a thin laptop. He was a man in his late 40s with perfectly styled hair and an expensive tailored suit that cost more than my first car. He looked up with a flash of intense irritation, ready to berate whoever had interrupted his morning schedule. He opened his mouth to speak, but stopped the moment he recognized my face. He expected to see the shuffling, confused old man he had diagnosed just weeks prior. Instead, he saw a man standing tall with broad shoulders and a gaze as cold as winter ice. I reached behind me and pushed the heavy door shut. I turned the brass thumb lock until it engaged with a loud, definitive click. The sound echoed in the quiet office, sealing the two of us inside. Keller stood up from his leather chair. He tried to project an air of medical authority, telling me that I could not be back here and that I needed to wait in the lobby. I walked slowly toward his desk, my heavy boots sinking into the plush carpet. I did not raise my voice. I did not make any sudden movements. I simply reached into the breast pocket of my jacket and pulled out 2 folded pieces of paper. I placed them flat on the pristine glass surface of his desk and slid them across until they rested directly over his keyboard. The first piece of paper was a high-resolution photograph I had printed at the local library. It clearly showed the hidden commercial router nestled inside the wall cavity of my home, with the heavy steel lockbox bolted below it. The second piece of paper was the certified toxicology report from the independent laboratory highlighting the massive doses of the heavy antipsychotic in my system. Keller looked down at the papers. The arrogant medical authority completely vanished from his face. I watched the blood drain from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly, pale white. His eyes darted from the chemical name on the laboratory report to the photograph of the surveillance equipment, and finally back up to my face. He swallowed hard, his posture completely crumbling. I placed my hands flat on his desk and leaned forward. I told him in a voice devoid of any emotion that I needed my raw, unedited medical file right now. I told him I wanted the actual notes he took during my examination before my son paid him to rewrite my medical history. Keller started to stammer. He tried to fall back on his medical training, claiming that I was confused and that paranoia was a common symptom of my declining condition. His eyes flicked nervously toward the sleek black telephone sitting on the corner of his desk. He was calculating whether he had enough time to hit the button for building security before I could reach him. I did not let him finish his lie. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I woke the screen and placed it face up next to his telephone. The dial pad was already open. I had pre-entered the direct emergency reporting number for the State Medical Licensing Board. I tapped my finger against the screen. I told him that he had 2 choices. He could log into his secure portal and give me the exact documents I asked for, or I could press the green call button. I explained that I would gladly tell the licensing board how a prominent local physician was actively prescribing lethal doses of black box antipsychotics to a healthy man in order to facilitate a multi-million-dollar real estate fraud. I watched him process the absolute destruction of his career, his reputation, and his freedom. He knew I had the toxicology report. He knew he was trapped. Keller slowly sank back into his leather chair, the fight completely draining out of him. His hands trembled as he reached for his laptop. He typed in his administrative password and opened his private, secure medical portal. He navigated through the digital folders until he found my patient file. I walked around the large glass desk and stood directly behind him, watching the screen over his shoulder. I took the computer mouse from his shaking hand and began to click through the hidden subfolders myself. I found his original clinical notes from my annual physical. The notes clearly stated that my cognitive function was perfect, my memory was sharp, and my physical health was excellent for a man my age. Then I found the separate folder hidden deep within the directory. It was labeled under my daughter-in-law's maiden name. I opened it and found a long email thread between Dr. Keller and Megan's corporate marketing firm. I read the messages in complete silence, feeling a deep sickness in my stomach. Megan had not just asked for a favor. She had drafted a legally binding corporate contract. The emails explicitly guaranteed Dr. Keller a highly lucrative corporate wellness consulting position with her firm. The contract included a massive retainer fee of $150,000. But the final email in the thread contained the most damning evidence of all. Megan had written that the retainer funds would be released to his offshore account the exact moment the sale of the Reynolds farm to the Industrial Logistics Company was finalized. It was a beautifully documented paper trail of criminal bribery. Keller had sold his soul, his ethics, and my entire life for a corporate payout. I opened a new tab on his web browser and logged into my own secure private email account. I attached the original healthy medical notes, the falsified dementia diagnosis, and the entire chain of bribery emails to a single message. I clicked send, forwarding the undeniable proof of their conspiracy directly to my encrypted inbox. I waited for the confirmation notification to appear on my phone. Once the files were secure, I deleted the sent message from Keller's computer and logged out of my account. I stepped back from the desk. Keller was staring blankly at his keyboard, looking like a man who was already sitting in a prison cell. He asked me in a quiet, defeated whisper what I was going to do. I did not give him the satisfaction of an answer. I picked up my toxicology report and the photograph of the routier from his desk. I folded them carefully and placed them back into my jacket pocket. I walked to the door, unlocked the brass deadbolt, and stepped back out into the brightly lit hallway. I had the medical proof I needed. I had the financial motive completely documented. The legal foundation of their entire plan had just been quietly demolished. Now I needed to build my own fortress to protect my land before they realized they had already lost everything. I left the suffocating atmosphere of the medical clinic and stepped out into the bright afternoon sun. I had the raw medical file and the bribery emails secured on my phone, but I knew perfectly well that was only half the battle. Having proof of a crime does not automatically stop a bulldozer from tearing down your barn. Matthew had already filed the legal paperwork. The wheels of the family court system were already in motion, and they grind incredibly fast when grease is applied. If I just went to the local police right now, it would trigger a massive, chaotic investigation that could drag on for months. During that time, my assets could be frozen, and the preliminary lease with the Industrial Logistics Company might still give them grounds to occupy my land or begin surveying for demolition. I needed a shield. I needed legal armor that was absolutely impenetrable even against forged medical decrees. I got back into my truck and merged onto the interstate, heading straight for the heart of the financial district downtown. I was going to see an old acquaintance named Simon Fisher. Simon was a ruthless high-stakes estate attorney who operated out of a towering glass building overlooking the river. We came from entirely different worlds. He wore custom Italian suits, and I wore faded denim work shirts. But 10 years ago, Simon had purchased a small hobby farm out near my county. He had absolutely no idea how to manage the land or the unpredictable weather. A severe spring flood caused the local river to crest, and the rising water nearly wiped out his entire property along with his expensive prize horses. I had seen the panic in his eyes. I had taken my heavy diesel equipment over to his place and spent 3 grueling days digging deep drainage trenches and building reinforced retaining walls in the pouring rain. I saved his farm from total ruin, and I never charged him a single dime. He told me back then that if I ever needed a favor, I only had to knock on his door. I was about to cash in that decade-old chip. I walked into the polished marble lobby of his firm, ignoring the strange looks from the corporate staff who stared at my work boots. Simon was walking out of a glass conference room when he saw me standing there. He stopped dead in his tracks. He took one look at my face, immediately canceled the rest of his afternoon appointments, and brought me back into his private corner office. I sat down in a heavy leather chair and laid out absolutely everything on his pristine desk. I showed him the forged medical documents, the toxicology report from the independent lab, the hidden camera photograph of the router, and the printed bribery emails from my daughter-in-law. Simon did not speak for a very long time. He read every single page, his face growing darker and more severe with every passing second. When he finally looked up, his eyes were sharp and incredibly cold. He told me that what my son was doing was not just unethical or greedy. It was a highly sophisticated predatory attack designed to completely obliterate my legal existence. Simon immediately logged into the state court database to check the confidential family court docket. He found the legal filing instantly. He told me Matthew had officially petitioned for a temporary emergency conservatorship. The hearing was scheduled for next Wednesday morning. Simon leaned back and explained the brutal, terrifying reality of the local legal system. He said, if we marched into family court and fought the conservatorship head-on, the judge would likely freeze all my assets, pending a full independent medical investigation. A bitter legal battle could tie up the farm and my bank accounts for years. I would be trapped in a nightmare of endless hearings, depositions, and court-mandated psychiatric evaluations, while Matthew continued to play the role of the deeply concerned son. Meanwhile, the logistics company could use the legal ambiguity to force a heavy settlement, or even begin their preliminary demolition under the guise of an active signed lease. I could not afford a prolonged defensive war of attrition. I needed a preemptive nuclear strike that would end the battle before Matthew even knew we were fighting. Simon leaned across his massive desk and proposed a radical legal maneuver. He called it decanting. He explained that a standard will or a local living trust was completely vulnerable to a local judge who might be swayed by forged medical documents and a weeping family member. But we could pour my assets from my current vulnerable state into a brand new, completely untouchable vessel. He suggested establishing a specific type of irrevocable blind trust based entirely in the state of South Dakota. He carefully explained that South Dakota possessed the most aggressive and protective trust laws in the entire country. Once a physical asset or a bank account was legally placed inside one of these specific trusts, it became entirely immune to local state court orders, civil lawsuits, and emergency conservatorship demands. It was a financial fortress with walls 100 feet high and a moat that no local judge could cross. There was only one significant catch to this plan. Simon looked me dead in the eye and told me that the word irrevocable meant exactly what it sounded like. If I signed these legal papers, I would no longer be the actual owner of the 50-acre farm. I would no longer own my pension, my savings accounts, or the beautiful farmhouse I had built by hand for my late wife, Diane. The South Dakota Trust would own absolutely everything. I would be listed as a primary beneficiary, but I would permanently surrender direct control to an appointed legal trustee. Simon formally offered to serve as that trustee, legally bound by severe fiduciary duty to protect the assets for my exclusive benefit. I sat there in the silent office listening to the faint hum of the city traffic far below the window. I thought about the sweat, the blood, and the tears I had poured into that soil over the last 40 years. I thought about giving up ownership of the only physical place I had ever truly called home. The hesitation lasted only a fraction of a second. I realized with absolute clarity that having my name on a piece of paper meant absolutely nothing if my own blood relative was willing to chemically poison me to take it away. I looked at Simon and told him to draft the documents immediately. His team of paralegals flew into action. For the next 2 hours, his corner office became a chaotic war room. They rapidly drafted the comprehensive trust framework, registered the new legal entity in the South Dakota jurisdiction, and prepared the massive stack of property transfer deeds. I sat at the mahogany conference table with a heavy brass pen in my hand. I signed my name over and over again on the dotted lines. With every single stroke of the pen, I was legally giving away everything I had ever worked for in my entire life. But I did not feel a sense of loss or defeat. I felt an overwhelming sense of absolute power returning to my hands. I transferred the title of the entire 50 acres. I transferred the primary checking accounts, the retirement savings accounts, and the emergency funds. I legally severed myself from my own lifetime of wealth. By the time the sun began to dip below the towering city skyline, the intricate legal process was finally complete. Simon stamped the final official seal on the heavy leather binder enclosing the documents. He looked at me with a grim, satisfied smile and told me that Stephen Reynolds was now legally a man with 0 assets to his name. He said my son could waive his forged medical documents in front of any local judge he wanted. Matthew could demand control of my vast estate until he was blue in the face. But there was absolutely nothing left for him to take. The family farm was completely out of his reach, locked away securely behind a legal wall he could never possibly climb. I thanked Simon, shook his hand, and walked out of the towering glass building into the evening. The air felt entirely different. The suffocating weight of vulnerability had completely vanished from my shoulders. I got back into my truck and started the long, dark drive back to the quiet country. The defensive phase of my operation was officially over. I had completely secured the land and neutralized their foundational legal strategy. Now it was finally time to go on the offensive. Matthew and Megan still believed they were holding all the winning cards. They still firmly believed I was swallowing their bright yellow poison every single morning, without question. They still planned to come over to my farmhouse on Sunday evening for our weekly family dinner and pretend to be my loving, devoted caretakers. I gripped the leather steering wheel, my mind razor-sharp, and my resolve entirely hardened into steel. I was going to let them come over. I was going to sit quietly at the head of my dining table and let them play their twisted little game. But this time I was setting a trap right in the middle of my own home, and I was going to sit back and watch them walk straight into it. Sunday evening arrived with a heavy gray overcast that matched the suffocating atmosphere inside my home. Right on schedule. At 5 o'clock, the headlights of Matthew's luxury sedan swept across the front windows. I sat in my armchair and listened to the heavy thud of the car doors closing. They walked up the porch steps, chatting happily, as if they were just 2 devoted children visiting their beloved father. The front door swung open, and Megan breezed into the foyer, carrying a large ceramic baking dish. The smell of roasted chicken and rosemary filled the air instantly. It was a smell that used to bring me immense comfort when Diane cooked, but now it just made my stomach turn. Matthew followed close behind, carrying a bottle of expensive red wine. He clapped me on the shoulder with a heavy, patronizing hand, asking how his favorite old man was holding up today. I gave him a weak, vacant smile. I forced my shoulders to slump and let my eyes drift toward the floor, playing the exact role they expected to see. Megan took charge of the kitchen immediately. She bustled around opening cabinets and clinking silverware as she set the dining room table. She spoke to me in that high-pitched, syrupy voice usually reserved for small toddlers or stray animals. She told me to sit down and relax because she had everything under control. I shuffled over to the heavy oak dining table and pulled out my chair. I sat at the head of the table, a position of authority that now felt like a mocked throne. Matthew uncorked the wine and poured 2 large glasses for himself and his wife, completely ignoring my empty water glass. He sat to my right, pulling out his smartphone and casually scrolling through his messages. They were so comfortable in their deception. They moved through my house as if they already owned it, as if I were nothing more than a lingering ghost. They were simply waiting to evaporate. Megan walked over from the kitchen counter, holding a small plastic cup and a fresh glass of ice water. She placed them carefully on the wooden table right next to my dinner plate. Inside the cup sat 3 bright yellow capsules. They were the harmless vitamin C pills I had meticulously crafted, but to her they were the heavy antipsychotic poison designed to erase my mind. She placed her manicured hand over mine, giving it a gentle squeeze. She looked at me with wide, sympathetic eyes and told me it was time for my medicine. She said she noticed I had been having a rough week and that the doctor said these new pills would help keep me calm and comfortable. It took every ounce of my willpower not to crush her fragile hand. I nodded slowly, acting as if I barely understood her words. I picked up the small plastic cup with a deliberately shaky hand. I tossed the yellow capsules into my mouth and took a large gulp of the ice water. I swallowed loudly, ensuring she saw the pills go down. The moment the water passed my throat, I executed my performance. I let a violent, manufactured tremor travel up my right arm. My hand jerked forward, slamming hard against the side of the heavy glass. The glass tipped over, crashing onto the table and sending a wave of ice water flooding across the polished oak wood. The water soaked into the expensive linen tablecloth and dripped heavily onto the floor. I let out a soft, pathetic gasp of fake panic. I began to swat uselessly at the water, apologizing repeatedly in a low, mumbled voice. I told them I was so sorry and that my hands just would not stop shaking lately. I watched their reactions carefully through the corner of my eye. Matthew did not even flinch. He just let out a long, exasperated sigh and rolled his eyes toward the ceiling, staring at me with a look of absolute disgust. But Megan smiled. It was a tiny, fleeting smirk of absolute sadistic victory that vanished as quickly as it appeared. She grabbed a dish towel and began to wipe up the mess, telling me in that same patronizing tone that it was perfectly fine and that accidents happen when people get old and confused. Megan took the wet towel back to the kitchen, leaving me sitting there looking utterly defeated. Matthew slid his phone back into his pocket and pushed his chair away from the table. He announced that he was going to use the restroom to wash up before we carved the chicken. He stood up, smoothed the front of his expensive sweater, and walked out of the dining room. He headed down the main hallway toward the guest bathroom. I sat completely still, staring down at my empty plate. I waited until the sound of his footsteps faded down the hall. Then I carefully reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I kept it hidden below the edge of the dining table, resting it flat on my lap. I opened the application connected to the hidden surveillance rotor. I did not tap on the bathroom camera feed. I knew exactly where my son was going. I tapped the feed for my private study. The screen on my phone flickered for a fraction of a second before displaying the crisp, high-definition feed of my study. The room was dark, but the infrared night vision illuminated everything perfectly. The heavy mahogany door creaked open, and Matthew slipped inside, closing it quietly behind him. He did not turn on the overhead light. He pulled a small pen light from his pocket and swept the beam across the room. He moved directly to my solid wood desk. He did not look like a concerned son checking on his father's paperwork. He looked exactly like a common thief tearing through a house he was about to rob. I watched him pull open the heavy bottom drawer where I kept my financial records. He rummaged through the hanging folders, tossing old tax returns and utility bills onto the floor in his careless haste. He finally found exactly what he was looking for. He pulled out my thick, leather-bound checkbook registry and a stack of recent bank statements. These were the documents tied to the primary checking and savings accounts. They were the exact same accounts I had completely emptied and legally transferred into the blind trust just 2 days ago with my attorney. Matthew opened the checkbook and placed it flat on the desk. He pulled out his phone and began snapping rapid photographs of the account numbers, the routing information, and the available balances printed on the old statements. He was documenting his financial targets. He needed those specific banking details to execute his fraudulent wire transfers later in the week before the conservatorship hearing even took place. He believed he was securing the keys to a kingdom of vast wealth. He had absolutely no idea that he was photographing the combination to an empty vault. I watched him work with a cold, mechanical precision. I knew the legal trap I had set was flawless. The banking accounts he was currently photographing technically still existed, but they held zero funds. Any attempt to authorize a massive wire transfer out of those specific accounts would immediately bounce. More importantly, it would instantly trigger an automatic federal banking alert for unauthorized fraudulent activity. Matthew was not just stealing numbers, he was literally documenting his own one-way ticket to federal prison. He meticulously replaced the checkbook and the statements, making sure the drawer looked exactly as he had found it. He slipped out of the study and silently closed the door. I quickly closed the application on my phone and slid the device back into my pocket just as the toilet flushed down the hall. A minute later, Matthew walked back into the dining room, drying his hands on a small hand towel. He took his seat at the table, picking up his glass of wine and taking a long, satisfied sip. He looked over at Megan and gave her a subtle, confirming nod. They both thought they had completely won the war. They thought they had poisoned my mind, secured the corrupted medical documentation, and now possessed the financial roadmap to steal every single dollar I had ever earned in my life. Megan brought the roasted chicken to the table and began carving it into thick slices. She served Matthew a massive portion and then placed a small, carefully cut piece onto my plate. She told me to eat slowly so I would not choke. I picked up my fork and began to eat, keeping my eyes downcast. The food tasted like ash in my mouth, but I chewed and swallowed mechanically, playing my part flawlessly. I sat there in the warm light of the dining room, surrounded by the people who shared my blood, and realized they were nothing more than dangerous parasites. I listened to them talk casually about their upcoming vacation plans and the expensive renovations they were planning for their suburban home. They were actively spending my money in their greedy minds. I let them talk. I let them enjoy their delicious roasted chicken and their fine, expensive wine. They were busy gathering the heavy rope they needed for their own destruction, and I was more than happy to sit back and supply the knots. The trap was perfectly set, the bait was swallowed whole, and tomorrow morning, the brutal consequences of their arrogance would begin to arrive right at my front door. Monday morning arrived with a crisp, unforgiving chill in the air. I woke up long before dawn, completely energized by the adrenaline of the impending battle. The weekend had been a masterclass in deception, but today the real tactical warfare would begin. I knew exactly what Matthew and Megan needed to accomplish today. The emergency family court hearing was scheduled for Wednesday morning. In order for the judge to grant them total legal control over my life and my assets, they needed a finalized, notarized medical proxy document submitted to the county clerk by Tuesday afternoon. They could not submit the paperwork without an official state seal proving that I had willingly signed my own rights away. I sat at my kitchen table drinking black coffee and watching the gravel driveway through the front window. I was waiting for their messenger to arrive. Just before 9 o'clock, a small rusted sedan pulled off the main road and slowly crept up my driveway. It was not a municipal vehicle or an official court transport. It was a cheap, personal car. A young woman stepped out of the driver's seat, clutching a worn leather briefcase against her chest. She looked incredibly nervous. She kept checking the screen of her phone and glancing around the property as if she expected a guard dog to attack her at any moment. She walked up the wooden steps of my front porch, her heels clicking hesitantly against the wood. She raised her hand to knock, but I opened the heavy front door before her knuckles could even touch the wood. She let out a sharp gasp and took a step backward. She was expecting to find the shuffling, confused old man that Megan had undoubtedly described to her. Instead, she found a tall, broad-shouldered farmer standing perfectly straight, with a gaze that could cut through solid ice. She swallowed hard and clutched her briefcase tighter. She stammered her introduction, telling me she was a mobile notary public hired by a marketing firm in the city. She said she was looking for the Reynolds residence to finalize some time-sensitive medical proxy signatures. I did not glare at her. I simply offered a polite, calm smile and stepped aside, inviting her into my home. I told her the morning air was too cold to stand on the porch and offered to pour her a fresh cup of coffee. She hesitated, her eyes darting nervously down the hallway, but the sheer normalcy of my invitation confused her. She stepped inside and followed me into the kitchen. I directed her to sit at the exact same oak table where my son had plotted his financial theft the night before. I walked over to the counter and poured a hot cup of coffee into a ceramic mug. I picked up my smartphone, navigating to the voice recording application, and silently pressed the red record button. I walked back to the table, placed the coffee mug in front of her, and set my phone completely flat on the wood right next to the sugar bowl. The screen was dark, but the microphone was actively capturing every single sound in the room. I sat down across from her and folded my hands on the table. I asked her in a gentle conversational tone to show me the documents we needed to finalize. She unzipped her leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal papers. I recognized the formatting immediately. It was the final addendum for the emergency conservatorship, granting Matthew absolute and total control over my medical care, my property, and my finances. I looked at the bottom of the last page. There was already a signature on the dotted line. It was a flawless forgery of my own handwriting. She nervously pulled a heavy brass stamp from her bag and placed it on the table. She told me she just needed to apply her official state seal to the paper to verify the signatures, and then she would be out of my way. The polite host facade evaporated instantly. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a low, chilling register. I looked directly into her eyes and asked her exactly how much Megan had paid her to skip the mandatory identity verification protocol. The young woman froze completely. The color drained from her face and her hand began to tremble so violently that her coffee cup rattled loudly against the wooden table. She tried to deny it, stammering that she did not know what I was talking about and that she was just doing her job. I did not raise my voice. I simply tightened the snare. I recited the exact state laws regarding the duties of a notary public. I explained that applying an official state seal to a document containing a forged signature without witnessing the physical act of signing was a severe federal offense. I told her that participating in a conspiracy to defraud an elderly citizen of a multi-million-dollar estate carried a mandatory minimum prison sentence. I bluffed, leaning entirely on my intuition and the financial desperation written all over her face. I told her I already knew Megan had handed her an envelope containing $2,000 in cash over the weekend to simply rubber stamp the documents without asking any questions. The bluff struck her like a physical blow. The young woman completely shattered. She covered her face with her hands and began to sob uncontrollably right there at my kitchen table. The confession poured out of her in a frantic, desperate flood. She admitted everything. She said Megan had contacted her late Friday night, offering her the cash under the table. Megan had spun a tragic story claiming that her father-in-law was violently unstable, suffering from severe dementia, and could not safely be in the same room as a government official. Megan told her it was an act of mercy to just stamp the pre-signed papers and walk away. The young woman cried that she was drowning in medical debt and desperately needed the money to keep her apartment. I listened to her tragic story without a single ounce of pity. Ignorance and desperation were not valid legal defenses for participating in the destruction of my life. I reached out and tapped the dark screen of my smartphone, waking it up to display the active recording timer. I told her that her entire confession was now digitally secured. She stared at the phone, her eyes wide with absolute terror. She begged me not to call the police, crying that a felony conviction would ruin her entire life and take her away from her young daughter. She promised to tear up the documents and give the bribe money back to Megan. I told her I did not care about the money. I offered her a very narrow escape route, but the toll would be incredibly high. I demanded her official state-issued notary journal. Every single licensed notary is required by law to maintain a sequential physical logbook of every document they stamp, logging the dates, the times, and the types of identification provided. It is the ultimate legal ledger. If she handed over the journal, she could walk out my front door and disappear. If she refused, I would dial the state fraud division right then and there and hand them the audio recording of her confession. She did not hesitate for a second. She reached into her leather briefcase with shaking hands and pulled out a thick, black-bound ledger. She slid it across the table toward me. I opened the cover and flipped to the most recent page. Right there on the last line was the entry for the Reynolds medical proxy. The entry was completely filled out, claiming she had verified my state driver license and witnessed my signature. It was the physical, undeniable proof of the fraudulent conspiracy. It was the final nail in the coffin for Matthew's legal strategy. I picked up the heavy black journal and stood up from the table. I walked down the hall to my private study. I opened the heavy steel floor safe hidden beneath the rug and placed the notary journal inside, right next to the toxicology report and the bribery emails from Dr. Keller. I spun the dial, locking the vault tight. I walked back into the kitchen and pointed my finger toward the front door. I told the young woman to leave the unsealed forged documents on my table, pack her bag, and get off my property immediately. I warned her that if she ever contacted Megan or Matthew to warn them about what happened here today, I would send the audio recording directly to the district attorney. She scrambled out of her chair, leaving her half-empty coffee cup behind. She practically ran down the hallway and out the front door. I stood on the porch and watched her rusted sedan speed down the gravel driveway, kicking up a cloud of dust as it merged onto the main road and disappeared. The silence returned to the farmhouse. I walked back into the kitchen and looked at the forged proxy documents resting harmlessly on the wood. Matthew's legal weapon had been completely neutralized. He had no proxy, no seal, and no valid conservatorship filing for Wednesday. I sat back down at the table and took a sip of my coffee, feeling a deep sense of tactical satisfaction. But the war was far from over. Just as I settled into my chair, my smartphone vibrated violently against the table. The screen lit up with an automated high-priority alert from my primary brokerage firm. Matthew was not waiting for the legal dust to settle. He was making his aggressive move on the liquid cash. The notification stated that a massive wire transfer had just been initiated out of my accounts. The final financial confrontation had officially begun. Tuesday morning brought a heavy rain that washed over the farmhouse in relentless gray sheets. I sat alone in my study, listening to the rhythmic drumming of the water against the window panes. The house felt completely different to me now. It was no longer a quiet cage where I waited to be slowly erased from existence. It had become a tactical command center. I had spent the early hours of the morning reviewing the documents Simon had provided, making absolutely sure every legal defense was locked perfectly into place. The decanting of the trust was complete, and the farm was legally untouchable. The notary journal was secured deep inside my steel floor safe. The corrupted medical file was backed up on multiple secure encrypted servers. But I knew Matthew was not going to sit idly by and wait for Wednesday morning to arrive. Greedy men are inherently impatient creatures. They cannot stand the thought of vast wealth sitting just out of their immediate reach. I kept my smartphone resting face up on the polished wood of my desk, waiting for his inevitable greedy mistake. At exactly 12 minutes past noon, the phone vibrated violently against the wood. A harsh electronic chime echoed through the quiet study, cutting through the sound of the rain. I picked up the device and looked at the glowing screen. It was an automated high-priority security alert from the national headquarters of my primary brokerage firm. I slid my finger across the glass and opened the secure message. The text was blunt and entirely devoid of emotion, but the numbers printed on the screen were absolutely staggering. A wire transfer in the amount of $300,000 had just been officially initiated out of my primary liquid investment account. I stared at the screen, feeling a cold wave of absolute disgust wash over me. The destination of the massive transfer was not a standard recognized bank. It was a private limited liability company. The name of the receiving corporate entity was registered directly under Megan's maiden name. The sheer audacity of the theft was breathtaking. They were not even waiting for the emergency conservatorship hearing on Wednesday to finalize their legal control over my life. They knew the preliminary lease with the industrial logistics company would take a few days to process the initial corporate cash advance. They were entirely drained of patience and wanted immediate access to liquid wealth right this very second. They were trying to completely gut my life savings before the farm sale even closed or the judge signed the final order. Matthew had taken the routing numbers and account details he hastily photographed in my study on Sunday night, and he was using them to bypass the local banking protocols entirely. He was initiating a massive digital heist from the comfort of his own suburban living room, believing I was staring blankly at a wall somewhere. My very first instinct, the reaction of any normal person being robbed blind, was to call the local bank branch downtown. I wanted to yell at the branch manager, demand they stop the transfer, and send the local police to my son's house. But my mind was no longer clouded by panic or yellow pills. I stopped myself immediately and took a deep breath. Calling the local branch would be a catastrophic tactical error. Matthew was well known in our small town. He had numerous business connections, and he might even know the local bank manager personally through his social circles. A local financial dispute could be easily dismissed as a simple family misunderstanding. Even worse, it could be directly attributed to my supposed cognitive decline. Matthew could simply claim he was acting under my verbal instructions to secure the funds for my impending medical care. The local authorities might just freeze the accounts temporarily while they sorted it out, leaving him free to try again later. I did not want a temporary hold. I wanted a permanent federal cage. I closed the alert message and opened the secure encrypted contact list Simon had provided me the previous afternoon. I did not dial the local bank. I dialed the direct emergency wire fraud hotline for the national brokerage headquarters located 3 states away. The call connected instantly, completely bypassing the standard frustrating customer service queues. A stern professional voice answered the line, identifying himself as a senior federal fraud investigator for the massive financial institution. I did not sound panicked or confused when I spoke. I spoke with absolute clarity and mechanical precision. I identified myself as Stephen Reynolds and stated that a massive unauthorized wire transfer had just been initiated on my primary investment account. The investigator immediately asked me to verify my identity. This was the exact moment where Matthew's entire fraudulent plan began to fatally unravel. If Matthew had simply tried to impersonate me on the phone later that day, he might have succeeded with a low-level teller. But Simon had anticipated this exact digital scenario. During our intense meeting on Monday, Simon had helped me establish a highly complex multi-factor authentication protocol with the national headquarters. It was a rigorous system designed specifically for high-net-worth clients to prevent exactly this kind of domestic financial abuse. I provided the federal investigator with my standard account numbers and my social security details. Then he asked for the secondary security clearance. I opened a separate secure application on my phone and read him a constantly changing 16-digit alphanumeric code. The investigator typed the code into his system. I heard the sharp clatter of his keyboard through the phone speaker. A moment later, his tone shifted from suspicious to entirely deferential. My identity was completely and undeniably verified at the highest federal corporate level. I was legally confirmed by their secure system to be a perfectly lucid, competent adult man managing his own vast estate. The carefully constructed narrative of the confused, helpless dementia patient was officially dead in the eyes of the national banking system. I instructed the investigator to pull up the exact details of the $300,000 transfer. He confirmed the exact time the transaction was initiated and verified the destination routing numbers belonging to Megan's shell company. He asked me directly if I had authorized this massive movement of wealth or if anyone else had legal permission to act on my behalf. I told him absolutely not. I stated clearly and firmly that my private account credentials had been stolen by a family member and that the transfer was entirely fraudulent and malicious. The investigator did not hesitate for a single second. He told me he was immediately enacting a hard federal freeze on the transaction. I listened to the deeply satisfying sound of his keyboard as he executed the irreversible command. He explained the technical reality of what was happening in that exact moment. The money did not simply bounce back into my account, where Matthew could try to steal it again. Because the transfer crossed state lines and involved a suspected corporate shell company, the transaction was intercepted mid-flight by the automated federal banking security grid. The $300,000 was instantly diverted and locked down inside a highly secure federal evidence-holding vault. I sat back in my heavy leather chair, feeling a profound sense of absolute victory. I asked the investigator what the next steps were in their protocol. He explained that because the fraudulent amount vastly exceeded the federal threshold of $10,000 and involved interstate digital communication, it automatically triggered a mandatory government reporting protocol. The brokerage firm was legally required by federal law to immediately notify the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. He told me that a specialized federal agent from the Cyber Fraud Division would be officially assigned to the case within the hour. Matthew and Megan thought they were being incredibly clever and modern. They thought using a digital wire transfer to a newly formed shell company would make the massive theft untraceable and perfectly clean. They had absolutely no idea how modern digital forensics actually operated. Every single time Matthew logged into that banking portal, he left a permanent glowing digital fingerprint. The security system had already logged his specific internet protocol address. It had logged the exact geographic location of his suburban home router. It had recorded the unique device identification number of his personal smartphone. He had willingly handed the federal government a perfectly packaged, meticulously documented trail of evidence leading directly back to his own front door. The investigator assured me that my remaining liquid assets were completely secure and that the fraudulent actors would have absolutely no access to the federal holding vault under any circumstances. I thanked him for his rapid and professional assistance and ended the call. I placed the phone back down on the desk. The rain continued to beat heavily against the window, but the raging storm inside my life was entirely under my control. Matthew and Megan were currently sitting in their expensive house completely unaware that their privileged lives were effectively over. They were probably celebrating right now, drinking expensive wine and dreaming about how they were going to spend my $300,000. They had no idea that the money they thought they had successfully stolen was currently sitting locked in a federal evidence vault. They had no idea that their names were actively being populated into a federal criminal database for major felonies. They had arrogantly stepped over the line from local elder abuse directly into the terrifying realm of major federal wire fraud. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the window, looking out at the dark, rain-soaked fields of my beautiful farm. The decanted trust protected the physical land. The locked safe protected the medical truth. And now the federal government was actively hunting my enemies. Tomorrow morning was Wednesday. Tomorrow morning, the transport van would arrive to take me away to the memory care facility. Matthew would be standing on my front porch, holding his forged court documents, feeling like the absolute king of the world. I smiled a cold, hard smile. I was going to pack my bags and walk out that door right on schedule. I was going to let him lead me straight into the final act of this tragedy, because I knew exactly how the curtain was going to fall. Wednesday morning broke with a brilliant, piercing sunlight that completely washed away the heavy gray storm of the previous day. The sky was an endless, stretching blue, completely devoid of clouds. It felt like the universe was offering a perfectly clear stage for the final act of my family tragedy. I woke up at exactly 5 in the morning, completely rested and entirely focused. My mind was razor-sharp, completely free from the toxic yellow haze that had plagued me for the last 6 months. I walked into the kitchen and brewed a final pot of strong black coffee. I poured a cup and stood by the large bay window, watching the morning dew glisten on the tall grass of the lower pasture. I knew exactly what was coming today. The legal machine my son had set into motion was about to arrive right at my front door. I spent the next hour walking through the quiet rooms of the farmhouse I had built with my own 2 hands. I ran my fingers along the custom oak trim I had cut and sanded decades ago. I stood in the doorway of Diane's old sewing room, looking at the newly patched drywall where the hidden surveillance router had once been concealed. I did not feel a sense of tragic loss or impending doom. I felt the quiet, terrifying calm of a soldier standing on the very edge of a battlefield, waiting for the enemy to step blindly into the kill zone. I went to my bedroom and dressed meticulously. I did not wear my faded denim work shirts or my heavy scuffed leather boots. I put on a crisp white button-down shirt, a dark tailored suit jacket, and polished dress shoes. I wanted to look exactly like the man I truly was, a man of absolute authority and total competence. I walked into my study and picked up my old brown leather briefcase. Inside, I placed my fully charged smartphone containing the audio recordings and the digital evidence. I did not pack any clothes. I did not pack a toothbrush or any personal mementos. I knew with absolute certainty that I would not be spending a single night inside a memory care facility. I clicked the brass latches of the briefcase shut and carried it out to the front foyer. I stood there in the silent hallway, listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock. At exactly 8 o'clock, the heavy crunch of tires echoing on the long gravel driveway shattered the morning peace. I did not look out the window. I simply stood my ground, waiting. A moment later, I heard the heavy thud of multiple car doors closing. Footsteps crunched across the gravel and began to heavily ascend the wooden steps of my front porch. A loud, aggressive knock pounded against the solid wood of my front door. It was not the polite knock of a concerned visitor. It was the heavy, demanding pound of someone who believed they already owned the property and was simply demanding entry. I reached out and turned the brass handle, pulling the heavy door open. The morning air rushed in, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. Standing right in the center of my porch was my son Matthew. He was wearing a sharp, expensive business suit, his hair perfectly styled. He had a look of tight, artificial sorrow plastered across his face, but his eyes were gleaming with an undeniable, greedy triumph. Parked directly behind him in my driveway was a massive white commercial transport van. The words Oak Haven Memory Care were painted in sterile blue letters across the side panels. Flanking Matthew on either side were two incredibly large men wearing pristine white medical uniforms. They did not look like compassionate healthcare workers. They had thick, muscular necks and cold, indifferent eyes. They looked like specialized bouncers hired specifically to physically subdue uncooperative patients. They stood with their arms crossed over their chests, radiating a silent physical threat. Matthew took a step forward, his chin raised high in arrogance. He held up a thick stack of legal papers stamped with the heavy seal of the county family court. He spoke in a loud, overly enunciated voice, clearly projecting his words for the benefit of the two large orderlies standing behind him. He wanted them to hear what a responsible and deeply burdened son he was. "It is time, Dad," Matthew said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "I know you are confused right now, but you are becoming a severe danger to yourself and to this property. The judge reviewed your medical files and signed the emergency conservatorship order first thing this morning. We are taking you to a specialized facility where you can be properly looked after." He stepped closer, waving the forged court order in the air. He braced himself, planting his feet firmly on the wooden planks. He was entirely prepared for a massive, violent confrontation. He fully expected me to completely lose my mind. He thought I would scream that I was perfectly sane. He thought I would cry and beg him not to take me away from my home. He thought I would try to physically fight the orderlies, giving them the perfect excuse to forcefully restrain me and prove his fabricated narrative of my aggressive dementia. He had written a script in his head where he played the tragic hero subduing his violently unstable father. I looked at the forged court document in his hand, and then I looked directly into his eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I did not argue, plead, or resist in any way whatsoever. The absolute silence that stretched between us was heavier than concrete. I simply reached down and picked up my brown leather briefcase from the floor of the foyer. I stepped completely outside onto the porch and pulled the heavy front door shut behind me. I pulled my silver keys, from my pocket, inserted them into the deadbolt, and locked my house with a loud, definitive click. I turned back to face him, my expression completely blank and entirely devoid of any emotion. I spoke in a voice that was perfectly steady, incredibly calm, and crystal clear. "I am perfectly ready to go," I said. Matthew actually physically recoiled. He took a clumsy step backward, his expensive leather shoes scraping against the porch. He blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing as his brain completely failed to process what was happening. The entire situation had just entirely derailed from his carefully planned script. There was no screaming. There was no physical struggle. There was no tragic display of cognitive decline. There was just a sharply dressed, completely composed man locking his own front door and politely agreeing to step into a medical transport van. The two large orderlies looked at each other in obvious confusion. They had clearly been briefed to handle a highly volatile and deeply confused elderly patient. Instead, they were looking at a man who appeared more like a corporate executive heading to a morning board meeting. Their aggressive posture immediately relaxed. Matthew swallowed hard, trying desperately to regain his footing. He looked at my polished shoes and my tailored jacket, completely bewildered by my sudden physical transformation. He had not seen me stand this straight or speak this clearly in 6 entire months. He stammered slightly, waving his hand toward the driveway. "Good," he managed to choke out his voice, losing its confident theatrical edge. "That makes this much easier for everyone. Get in the van, Dad." I did not wait for the orderlies to escort me. I walked right past Matthew, my shoulder brushing past his arm. I walked down the wooden steps of my porch, holding my briefcase securely at my side. I approached the back of the white transport van. One of the orderlies quickly stepped forward and pulled the heavy metal doors open for me. He actually offered me his hand to help me step up into the back, but I ignored it, stepping easily into the sterile cabin. I sat down on the rigid vinyl bench seat facing the rear doors. Matthew stood in the driveway staring at me. The arrogant smirk had completely vanished from his face, replaced by a deep, unsettling paranoia. He could feel that something was entirely wrong, but he was too blinded by his own greed to figure out what it was. He gave a sharp, jerky nod to the orderly. The heavy metal doors slammed shut, plunging the back of the van into a dim, artificial light. The automatic locks engaged with a heavy clunk. I sat alone in the secure compartment. I felt the engine rumble to life beneath the floorboards. The van slowly turned around in the gravel driveway and began to roll toward the main road. I was physically locked inside a medical transport vehicle heading toward a locked memory care ward. But as I sat there listening to the hum of the tires on the asphalt, I had never felt more entirely free in my entire life. Matthew thought he had just successfully locked me in a cage. He had no idea that I had just handed him the keys to his own total destruction. The back of the medical transport van smelled heavily of industrial bleach and cheap pine air freshener. I sat on the rigid vinyl bench, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my leather briefcase resting flat across my knees. The 2 large orderlies sat opposite me, their massive arms folded across their chests. They were watching me closely, expecting the heavy sedatives they assumed I was taking to finally kick in and make me slump over. Matthew sat near the front of the cabin, right behind the thick plexiglass partition that separated the patient hold from the driver's cab. He was completely ignoring me. He had his expensive smartphone pressed against his ear, speaking in a hushed, urgent tone to his wife. I listened to his side of the conversation. He told Megan that the package was successfully secured and that he was on his way to the city to finalize the real estate closing. He actually used the word package to describe his own father. He sounded incredibly proud of himself, believing he had just flawlessly executed the ultimate deception. He had absolutely no idea that the man driving the van was no longer working for him. Late Tuesday night, after the federal banking investigator had locked down the fraudulent wire transfer, I had made one final move. I had used my encrypted laptop to dig into the background of the medical transport company Matthew had hired. I found the direct contact information for the specific driver assigned to my morning pickup. I called him at midnight. I did not threaten him or try to explain the complex legal situation. I simply appealed to the universal language of immediate cash. I offered to wire $5,000 directly into his personal bank account before sunrise if he agreed to ignore Matthew's destination instructions and drive the van exactly where I told him to go. $5,000 was more than he made in 2 months of driving hostile patients around the county. He accepted the offer immediately. The heavy van merged onto the interstate highway, picking up speed. The large windowless rear compartment vibrated constantly, but I felt completely at peace. Matthew finished his phone call with Megan and leaned back against his seat, tapping his fingers excitedly against his thigh. He looked at his expensive gold watch, calculating the time it would take to drop me off at the locked memory care ward and then drive himself to the corporate headquarters of Apex Industrial Logistics. He needed to be there by 10 o'clock to sign the final multi-million-dollar land lease. He thought his timing was absolutely perfect. We drove for 45 minutes. I watched the green highway signs flash past the small reinforced window set into the rear door. We were rapidly approaching exit 42. That was the exit for Oak Haven Memory Care, located in the quiet, isolated suburbs. Matthew leaned forward, gathering his coat and preparing to speak to the orderlies about the intake procedure. The green exit sign loomed closer and closer. The driver did not slow down. He did not engage the turn signal. He kept his foot firmly on the gas pedal and blew right past exit 42 at 70 miles an hour. Matthew frowned. He looked out the small rear window, watching the exit ramp disappear behind us. He turned toward the thick plexiglass partition and tapped his knuckles against it. He called out to the driver, telling him he had just missed the turnoff for the facility. The driver ignored him completely, keeping his eyes locked straight ahead on the road. Matthew tapped harder, his irritation rapidly escalating. He raised his voice, demanding that the driver take the next exit and turn the vehicle around immediately. He reminded the driver that he was paying for a premium private transport and expected competent service. The driver simply reached up to the dashboard and pressed a heavy black button. A solid metal privacy shade slid down over the plexiglass partition, completely blocking the cab from the rear compartment. We were now entirely isolated in the back of the van. The color drained instantly from Matthew's face. The smug, arrogant confidence evaporated, replaced by a sudden creeping panic. He turned to the two large orderlies, demanding they use their radios to contact the driver. The orderlies looked at each other in confusion. One of them pulled a black two-way radio from his belt and pressed the transmission button, ordering the cab to respond. The radio simply hissed with dead static. The driver had turned his receiver completely off. The van continued to speed down the interstate, leaving the quiet suburbs far behind. The landscape outside the small rear window began to change rapidly. The open fields and scattered trees were replaced by dense concrete overpasses and towering commercial billboards. We were heading directly into the heart of the downtown financial district. The morning traffic thickened, but our driver navigated the heavy commercial vehicle with aggressive precision, violently changing lanes and pushing deeper into the city. Matthew completely lost his grip on his carefully crafted reality. He stumbled forward, grabbing the metal handle of the partition door and yanking it violently. The door was electronically deadlocked from the cab. He began to slam his open palms against the metal privacy shade, screaming at the top of his lungs. He demanded to know where we were going. He threatened to have the driver fired, arrested, and sued for kidnapping. His voice cracked with genuine terror. He was no longer the brilliant puppet master controlling his father's fate. He was a trapped rat in a rolling metal cage, entirely at the mercy of forces he could not comprehend. The orderlies stood up, trying to calm Matthew down. They told him to take a seat for his own safety, but he pushed them away wildly. He turned around and looked at me. I was still sitting perfectly still, my hands resting on my briefcase, watching his total meltdown with cold, clinical interest. He stared at my calm demeanor, and his eyes widened in absolute horror. In that exact moment, the realization finally hit him. He realized I was not confused. He realized the route change was not a mistake. He realized he was not the one driving the nails into the coffin. The heavy van suddenly slowed down, making a sharp right turn onto a smooth paved surface. The vehicle crawled forward for a few more seconds before coming to a complete and final stop. The engine was cut off. The sudden silence in the rear compartment was deafening. Matthew stood frozen, his chest heaving rapidly as he stared at the rear doors. A loud electronic chime echoed through the cabin, and the heavy deadbolts on the rear doors disengaged with a sharp, mechanical snap. The doors were pulled wide open from the outside by the driver, revealing the bright morning sun and the towering landscape of the city. We were not parked in front of a sterile suburban medical facility. We were parked directly on the pristine circular driveway of a massive 60-story skyscraper constructed entirely of reflective blue glass. The massive silver letters mounted above the main entrance read Apex Industrial Logistics. I stood up from the vinyl bench, smoothing the front of my tailored suit jacket. I picked up my leather briefcase and walked calmly toward the open doors. Matthew scrambled backward, pressing himself against the wall of the van, as if I were a ghost. I paused right at the edge of the bumper, looking down at my son. His face was a mask of absolute, terrified confusion. I told him in a voice that was perfectly smooth and completely devoid of pity that since he was scheduled to sign the final contracts to sell my land today, I thought it was only appropriate that I attend the corporate closing. I stepped down out of the van, leaving him trembling in the dark interior. I did not wait for him to follow me. I turned my back on the vehicle and began walking directly toward the massive revolving glass doors of the corporate headquarters. I was about to walk into a boardroom filled with millionaires and ruthless real estate developers, and I was going to tear their multi-million-dollar deal into absolute shreds. I walked through the towering glass atrium of the Apex Industrial Logistics headquarters. The floor was polished marble that reflected the bright morning sunlight streaming through the massive architectural skylights. Security guards in dark, tailored suits stood near the elevator banks, monitoring the morning corporate rush. I walked with such absolute, unwavering purpose that they simply assumed I belonged there. I did not look like an escaped psychiatric patient wandering off a secure ward. I looked exactly like a man who owned the entire building. I stepped into the executive elevator alone and pressed the illuminated button for the 60th floor. The ride up was completely silent. I watched the digital floor numbers climb steadily higher, feeling the final pieces, my tactical trap snapping perfectly into their permanent positions. The elevator chimed softly, and the polished doors slid open to reveal a sprawling reception area decorated with sleek modern art and incredibly expensive leather furniture. A young executive assistant sat behind a massive curved mahogany desk. She stood up immediately, her face showing polite confusion, as she asked if I had a scheduled appointment with the board of directors. I completely ignored her question. I walked straight past her desk, heading directly down the wide, thickly carpeted hallway toward the massive double oak doors at the very end. I knew exactly where the multi-million-dollar closing was taking place. The assistant scrambled out from behind her desk, calling out to me in a panicked voice, telling me I could not go back there, but I did not break my stride for a single second. I reached out and pushed both heavy oak doors open with a forceful shove. The heavy wood swung inward, revealing the inner sanctum of corporate power. The boardroom was absolutely massive. A long, polished mahogany table stretched across the entire center of the room, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass windows that offered a dizzying panoramic view of the city skyline. Sitting around the table were 5 men in expensive dark suits. At the head of the table sat the chief executive officer of Apex Logistics, a man with silver hair and a sharp, predatory smile. His corporate legal team sat beside him with thick stacks of preliminary lease agreements resting in front of them. In the exact center of the table sat a silver ice bucket, holding a bottle of very expensive champagne. Several crystal flutes had already been poured. They were celebrating early. They were raising a glass to the successful acquisition of my family farm for a fraction of its true market value. The sudden violent opening of the heavy oak doors completely interrupted their toast. The CEO lowered his glass, his predatory smile instantly turning into a deep frown of corporate irritation. The lawyers turned in their high-backed leather chairs, entirely bewildered by my sudden, uninvited appearance. Before any of them could speak, a chaotic commotion erupted out in the hallway directly behind me. Matthew burst through the oak doors completely out of breath. His expensive suit was heavily wrinkled, and his silk tie was hanging loosely around his neck. His face was flushed crimson red and dripping with nervous sweat. He had apparently run the entire way up from the lobby after finally managing to escape the locked medical transport van in the circular driveway. He stumbled into the boardroom, looking completely unhinged. He pointed a violently shaking finger at my back and began screaming at the top of his lungs. He yelled for someone to call the building security immediately. He shrieked that I was his father and that I was a violently unstable escaped psychiatric patient suffering from advanced dementia. He told the stunned corporate executives that I was highly dangerous, unpredictable, and needed to be physically restrained by the authorities right this very second. The corporate lawyers immediately pushed their chairs back away from the table, genuinely alarmed by his frantic screaming. One of the attorneys reached nervously for the telephone console resting in the center of the mahogany wood. Matthew continued his desperate shouting, begging them not to listen to a single word I said, because my brain was completely rotted by disease. He was putting on the performance of a lifetime, desperately trying to rebuild the false medical narrative that had just spectacularly collapsed down in the parking lot. I did not shout back. I did not try to defend my sanity or my intelligence. I did not even turn around to look at my son. I simply let him scream his lies into the room. I walked straight past the panicked lawyers, keeping my posture perfectly straight, and approached the massive wooden presentation podium standing at the head of the long table. Resting on the podium was a sleek corporate laptop connected directly to the massive digital projector screen mounted on the wall. The screen was currently displaying the brightly colored Apex Logistics corporate logo. I set my brown leather briefcase down on the carpeted floor. I reached into my tailored jacket pocket and pulled out the small silver flash drive. I plugged it directly into the side port of the presentation laptop. The computer chimed, acknowledging the newly inserted device. I used the trackpad to open the secure folder I had meticulously compiled the night before. I did not look at the executives. I kept my eyes entirely focused on the computer screen. I found the high-definition video file labeled with the exact timestamp of the gas stove incident. I double-clicked the file and maximized the video player to fill the entire massive projector screen. Then I reached over and firmly pressed the play button. The bright corporate logo vanished instantly. The room was suddenly bathed in the eerie gray and white glow of the infrared night vision footage. The hidden surveillance camera feed of my dark farmhouse kitchen played out in massive cinematic detail across the boardroom wall. The screaming behind me abruptly stopped. Matthew froze completely. The color drained entirely from his flushed face, leaving him looking exactly like a walking corpse. The CEO and his legal team stopped reaching for the telephone console. They sat perfectly still, their eyes locked in absolute shock onto the giant illuminated screen. They watched the digital clock in the corner of the video tick forward. They watched the heavy back door of my house slowly open. They watched Matthew Reynolds, the very man they were about to hand millions of corporate dollars, to step directly into the frame. The high-definition camera captured his face with absolute, undeniable clarity. The executives watched in horrified silence as the video showed Matthew walking directly to my gas stove. They watched his hand reach out and deliberately turn the burner dial, flooding the closed house with raw, explosive gas. They watched him carefully pick up my car keys from the kitchen island, walk over to the refrigerator, and hide them deep inside the bottom freezer drawer. They watched him slip back out into the dark night, leaving his own father to potentially die in a catastrophic explosion. The video ended, and the projector screen went completely black. I did not replay it. Showing it once was more than enough to destroy his entire life. The silence that fell over the boardroom was absolutely suffocating. It was a heavy, thick quiet that physically pressed against the eardrums. The only sound in the massive room was the faint mechanical hum of the overhead air conditioning vents. The chief executive officer of Apex Logistics sat frozen in his chair, his hand still resting near the crystal stem of his champagne flute. Very slowly, he pulled his hand away from the glass, as if the crystal itself had suddenly become toxic. The corporate lawyers stared at the blank projector screen, their mouths hanging slightly open in complete disbelief. They had just witnessed a clear, undeniable felony. They had just watched the man sitting across the table from them commit attempted murder and severe elder financial abuse in order to secure the real estate deal they were currently celebrating. I turned away from the projector screen and finally looked down the length of the long mahogany table. I looked directly into the eyes of the CEO. His predatory smile was entirely gone, replaced by a look of profound legal terror. Corporate executives deal in risk assessment every single day of their lives. He was looking at me and rapidly calculating the massive, catastrophic liability his company had just blindly walked into. He realized with terrifying clarity that if his corporation signed a land lease based on a fraudulent conservatorship obtained through attempted murder, his entire company would be dragged into a massive federal criminal conspiracy. The public relations fallout and the subsequent federal investigations alone would completely destroy his logistics empire. I then turned my gaze toward the oak doors and looked at Matthew. He was standing completely paralyzed, his hands gripping the back of an empty leather chair. His chest was heaving, but he could not seem to draw a full breath of air into his lungs. The arrogant puppet master who thought he could steal my legacy was entirely gone. He was nothing but a broken, desperate man staring directly at the absolute destruction of his entire life. The video evidence was undeniable. It could not be explained away as a simple misunderstanding. It could not be blamed on my supposed dementia. It was raw, objective truth projected 20 feet wide for the most powerful men in the city to see. I placed my hands flat on the wooden podium. I spoke into the suffocating silence, my voice echoing slightly in the large, quiet room. I told the CEO that the man standing trembling by the door did not possess the legal authority to lease a single blade of grass on my property. I informed the corporate attorneys that the medical proxy they were relying on was secured through chemical poisoning, physical staging, and outright bribery of a licensed physician. I told them that if they proceeded with this transaction, they would be actively funding a major federal crime. The CEO did not argue with me. He did not ask his lawyers for clarification. He simply looked at Matthew with a gaze so incredibly cold it could freeze boiling water. The celebration was officially over. The trap had slammed completely shut, and Matthew was standing right in the middle of the steel jaws, with nowhere left to run. Matthew slammed both of his hands down onto the polished mahogany table with such violent force that the crystal champagne flutes rattled against the wood. He was completely unraveling. He reached frantically inside his wrinkled suit jacket and pulled out the thick stack of family court documents. He threw them across the table toward the chief executive officer of the logistics company. He screamed that the video I had just shown them was a complete fabrication. He yelled that it was a cheap digital trick designed by a sick and confused old man. He pointed a trembling finger at the official blue seal stamped on the bottom of his paperwork. He demanded that the corporate lawyers look at the signature of the local family court judge. He insisted that he held the absolute legal right to sign the lease right this very second, and demanded they hand him a pen to finalize the multi-million-dollar transaction. The corporate executives did not move a single muscle. The CEO was a ruthless businessman who built his massive empire by completely avoiding catastrophic liabilities. He smelled blood in the water, and he knew instantly that it was not mine. He looked down at the forged conservatorship papers scattered across his pristine table, and then he looked up at Matthew with an expression of absolute disgust. He told Matthew that corporate acquisitions of this magnitude rely on ironclad legal foundations, not unstable family disputes involving highly documented attempts at domestic murder. He stated firmly that Apex Industrial Logistics would never involve itself in a transaction tainted by active criminal fraud. Before Matthew could scream another desperate lie, the heavy oak boardroom doors swung open for a second time. The interruption commanded the attention of every single person in the room. Simon Fisher strode confidently through the doorway. My attorney looked completely in his element, wearing a bespoke charcoal suit and carrying a thick leather briefcase. He walked with the relaxed, terrifying authority of an apex predator entering a cage full of panicked mice. Simon was not alone. Two tall, broad-shouldered men stepped into the boardroom right behind him. They were wearing plain clothes, but their demeanor screamed law enforcement. They each pulled a leather badge holder from their pockets and let them hang open against their chests, revealing heavy gold shields. They were special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The agents did not say a word. They simply closed the heavy oak doors behind them and stood shoulder to shoulder, blocking the only exit out of the room. The trap was completely sealed. Simon walked directly to the center of the massive table, completely ignoring Matthew, who was now hyperventilating and clutching the back of a leather chair for physical support. Simon looked directly at the CEO and formally introduced himself as my senior legal counsel. He placed his briefcase on the table and popped the brass latches. He reached inside and pulled out the massive, heavy leather-bound document we had meticulously prepared on Monday afternoon. He slid the thick binder across the smooth wood until it came to rest directly on top of Matthew's forged family court orders, completely covering them up. Simon spoke with the absolute authority of a federal judge delivering a final, unappealable sentence. He informed the entire boardroom that the emergency conservatorship Matthew was frantically waving around was entirely useless. He explained that it did not matter if a local family court judge had signed it that morning. It did not matter if a corrupted physician had falsified the medical evaluation. Simon stated in a crystal-clear voice that reverberated through the quiet room that Matthew Reynolds did not own the 50-acre farm. He then turned his sharp gaze toward me and stated that Stephen Reynolds also did not own the 50-acre farm. Matthew blinked his eyes, darting frantically between me and the lawyer. He opened his mouth to speak, but Simon cut him off instantly. Simon placed his hand flat on the leather binder and explained the brutal, unyielding mechanics of the South Dakota Irrevocable Blind Trust. He told the corporate executives that every single blade of grass, every piece of timber, and every drop of water on my property had been legally transferred out of my personal name entirely. The land was now the sole sovereign property of the trust entity. Simon meticulously explained that under strict federal and state banking laws, a local county family court conservatorship cannot possibly pierce the armor of a sovereign trust located in another jurisdiction. A local judge in New York simply had no legal authority to dissolve a trust legally anchored in South Dakota. The land was completely legally untouchable. The executives listened with rapt attention, completely mesmerized by the sheer tactical brilliance of the legal maneuver. Matthew suddenly lunged forward, throwing his weight against the table, trying to grab the leather binder. He screamed that the trust was a trick. He yelled that the transfer was entirely invalid because I was chemically incompetent when I signed the documents on Monday. He shrieked that I was suffering from severe dementia and therefore lacked the mental capacity to legally give my farm away to a blind trust. Simon smiled. It was a cold, devastating smile that completely chilled the air in the room. He looked at my son and asked him a very simple, terrifying question. Simon asked Matthew how he could possibly prove in a court of law that I was chemically incompetent on the day I signed the trust. Simon pointed out with razor-sharp precision that the only way Matthew could medically prove I was under the influence of heavy sedatives was if he formally admitted to administering the quetiapine poison himself. The absolute genius of the trap finally dawned on Matthew. If he wanted to contest the validity of the trust and try to take the land back, he had to stand up in front of a federal judge and confess to chemically poisoning his own father. He had to confess to the exact felony crimes that the federal agents standing by the door were currently actively investigating. It was a perfect, inescapable legal paradox. Matthew was completely trapped inside a cage built entirely out of his own malicious lies. If he stayed silent, he lost the farm and all the money. If he fought the trust, he was actively signing his own lengthy prison sentence. The chief executive officer of Apex Logistics had heard absolutely enough. He was a man who protected his corporate empire above all rational feelings. He looked at the clear, unassailable legal title of the South Dakota Trust sitting on his table. He looked at the two federal agents standing silently by the exit. Then he looked at the pathetic, sweating mess of a man standing across from him. The CEO made a decisive corporate move. He reached out and picked up the massive multi-million-dollar preliminary land lease that Matthew was supposed to sign that morning. The CEO did not hand the contract to his legal team to be filed away. He stood up from his chair and walked over to the heavy industrial paper shredder sitting on the polished credenza behind his desk. He pressed the power button, activating the machine. He held the thick stack of premium corporate paper over the feed slot and dropped it straight in. The loud grinding noise of the steel blades rapidly chewing through the contract echoed violently through the silent room. I watched the white strips of paper fall into the clear plastic bin. That sound was not just paper being destroyed. It was the sound of Matthew's entire future being completely obliterated. It was the sound of his promised corporate wealth, his grand suburban renovations, and his arrogant delusions of grandeur being ground into absolute dust. The CEO turned off the machine and walked back to the table. He looked directly at Matthew and told him that Apex Industrial Logistics had absolutely zero interest in purchasing stolen land from a man currently under federal investigation for wire fraud and elder abuse. He ordered Matthew to get out of his building immediately and warned him never to contact his corporation ever again. Matthew turned toward the heavy oak doors entirely defeated. His shoulders were slumped. His head hung low, and his breathing was shallow and erratic. He took one step toward the exit, planning to run away and hide in his expensive suburban home. But the two federal agents stepped forward, blocking his path completely. They made it very clear, without saying a single word, that Matthew was not going back to his comfortable life. The legal guillotine had fallen cleanly, completely severing him from everything he thought he possessed. Matthew tried to push past the two men blocking the heavy oak doors, but his pathetic attempt at physical dominance was entirely useless. The federal agents did not even flinch. They stood like solid stone pillars, completely unmoved by his frantic energy. The taller of the two men stepped forward, closing the distance between them. He reached to his belt and unclipped a heavy pair of solid steel handcuffs. The metallic clatter of the chains echoed sharply in the quiet boardroom. He introduced himself as Special Agent Miller of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. His voice was completely devoid of emotion, sounding exactly like a machine processing a routine transaction. Agent Miller looked Matthew directly in the eye and delivered the fatal blow. He stated that Matthew Reynolds was officially under federal arrest. He listed the charges with methodical precision, letting each one hang heavily in the air. Conspiracy to commit major wire fraud, aggravated elder financial abuse, the deliberate falsification of federal medical documents. Each charge carried a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. Matthew stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the thick carpet. He retreated until his back hit the massive floor-to-ceiling glass window that overlooked the city. He pressed his palms flat against the cold glass, looking like a trapped insect pinned to a display board. The sheer cowardice of the man I had raised finally revealed itself in its absolute entirety. Matthew did not face his consequences with any shred of dignity. He began to desperately shift the blame, trying to throw anyone and everyone under the bus to save his own skin. He babbled uncontrollably, pointing his shaking finger at me, and then at the corporate executives, and finally at the empty air. He cried that it was not his idea. He claimed that his wife, Megan, had orchestrated the entire scheme because she was obsessed with maintaining their wealthy lifestyle. He yelled that Dr. Keller was the one who suggested the heavy antipsychotic medication and that he was just following medical advice. He was willing to sacrifice his own wife and his medical conspirator in a heartbeat if it meant he could walk out of that room. Agent Miller simply stepped closer, completely ignoring the pathetic display of betrayal. He grabbed Matthew's right wrist, twisting it firmly behind his back. Matthew let out a sharp gasp of pain as the cold steel bracelet ratcheted tightly around his wrist. Before the agent could secure the left hand, a sudden piercing sound shattered the heavy silence of the boardroom. It was a cheerful, upbeat ringtone echoing loudly from the inner pocket of Matthew's tailored suit jacket. The sound was incredibly jarring, completely out of place in the middle of a federal arrest. Matthew flinched instinctively, trying to reach for the device, but Agent Miller easily overpowered him. The agent reached into the jacket pocket and pulled out the sleek silver smartphone. The screen was glowing brightly, displaying a picture of Megan smiling on a sunny beach. She was calling him at the exact moment their entire criminal empire was collapsing. Agent Miller looked at the caller identification and then looked over at my attorney, Simon. Simon gave a short affirmative nod. Agent Miller did not decline the call. He swiped his thumb across the glass screen, answering the call, and immediately pressing the speakerphone button. He held the device up in the center of the quiet room, allowing the audio to broadcast clearly for everyone, including the corporate executives, to hear. Megan's voice instantly filled the room. She sounded frantic, incredibly irritated, and completely oblivious to the reality of the situation. She did not bother to say hello. She immediately demanded to know if the $300,000 wire transfer had cleared the federal holding account yet. Her voice was shrill and demanding, echoing off the mahogany walls. She complained bitterly that the luxury contractor they hired for their massive home renovation was sitting in their driveway right now, threatening to walk off the job completely if he did not receive his massive cash deposit by noon. She told Matthew that he needed to stop wasting time at the real estate closing and immediately force the bank manager to release my stolen funds to her shell company. It was the most perfect, undeniable confession a federal prosecutor could ever ask for. She had just formally admitted to participating in the fraudulent wire transfer, acknowledging the exact dollar amount, and openly confirming that the stolen money was intended for her personal home renovations. She had tightly wrapped the criminal noose around her own neck without anyone asking her a single question. Matthew squeezed his eyes shut, tears of absolute terror finally spilling down his pale cheeks. He opened his mouth to scream a warning to his wife to tell her to shut up and hang up the phone, but the second federal agent clamped a heavy hand firmly over his shoulder, silencing him completely. Agent Miller leaned slightly closer to the microphone of the smartphone. He spoke in that same cold, mechanical tone, completely cutting off Megan's ongoing rant about Italian marble countertops and custom cabinetry. He addressed her formally, calling her Mrs. Reynolds. He calmly introduced himself as a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The silence that followed on the other end of the line was absolute. The background noise of her suburban neighborhood seemed to completely vanish. For 3 long seconds, there was nothing but the faint sound of her drawing a sharp, terrified breath. Agent Miller did not give her time to formulate a lie or hang up the phone. He delivered his final instruction with chilling authority. He told Megan that she needed to put down her telephone and step outside onto her front porch, with her hands completely empty and clearly visible. He informed her that a federal tactical team was currently surrounding her property and that they were preparing to physically breach her front door in exactly 30 seconds. A sharp, piercing scream erupted from the speakerphone. It was a sound of pure primal panic. The scream was immediately followed by the loud, violent crash of heavy wood splintering and breaking apart. The federal agents had not waited for her to comply. They had driven a steel battering ram straight through the front door of her pristine suburban home. We could hear the chaotic shouting of multiple law enforcement officers flooding into her house, screaming at her to get down on the floor. We heard the sound of glass breaking, and Megan sobbing uncontrollably, begging them not to ruin her expensive hardwood floors. Then the line went completely dead. Agent Miller pressed the button to end the call and slipped the smartphone into a clear plastic evidence bag. Matthew finally collapsed. His legs simply gave out beneath him. He sank down onto the thick corporate carpet, resting on his knees, with his hands secured tightly behind his back. He wept openly, his face buried against the fabric of his ruined suit. The arrogant man who had tried to erase my mind and steal my farm was completely gone. He was nothing but a broken shell facing decades inside a federal prison cell. Agent Miller hauled him back to his feet with a forceful jerk. He read Matthew his Miranda rights, reciting the legal warnings as they marched him out of the boardroom. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind them, leaving the room in a state of absolute stunned silence. I stood at the head of the long mahogany table, looking at the empty space where my son had just been. I did not feel any joy or triumph. Taking down your own blood is not a victory to be celebrated. It is a tragic, necessary surgery to remove a fatal cancer. I packed my laptop into my leather briefcase and turned to walk away, leaving the corporate executives sitting in silent awe of the absolute destruction they had just witnessed. 6 months have passed since that morning in the corporate boardroom. The passage of time has a remarkable way of washing away the dirt left behind by greedy men. The air on the farm this morning was incredibly crisp and entirely clean. It smelled of damp earth and blooming wildflowers, a stark contrast to the sterile, suffocating atmosphere of the hospital clinics and federal courtrooms I had to endure. I woke up early, as I always do, and walked down the quiet hallway of my farmhouse. I stopped in front of Diane's old sewing room and gently pushed the door open. The room was no longer a crime scene. The massive gaping hole in the drywall where my son had hidden his surveillance equipment was completely gone. I had hired Pete, the original contractor, to come back and finish the job properly. He sealed the hollow void, packed it with fresh insulation, and hung brand new drywall. I spent an entire weekend painting the room a warm, soft yellow, honoring my late wife's favorite color. There was absolutely no trace of the electronic violation that had occurred inside those walls. The physical scar on my home had been entirely healed, and the psychological wound was closing right along with it. I walked into the kitchen and brewed a fresh pot of coffee, listening to the comforting, bubbling sound of the percolator. I walked over to the wooden dining table and picked up the morning edition of the local county newspaper. Tucked away on the 4th page was a small, brief article detailing the final conclusion of the federal investigation. There was no grand, dramatic trial. Matthew and Megan did not have the courage to stand in front of a jury and attempt to defend the absolute mountain of digital and audio evidence we had handed over to the authorities. They were completely crushed under the weight of their own documented arrogance. The article stated that they had officially accepted a plea deal from the federal prosecutor. They both pled guilty to major felony charges of interstate wire fraud and conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse. The judge did not show them a single ounce of leniency. The plea agreement guaranteed them a mandatory sentence of 5 solid years in a federal penitentiary without any possibility of early parole. I folded the newspaper and set it down on the table. I thought about Matthew trading his tailored Italian suits for a standard-issue prison uniform. I thought about Megan losing her pristine suburban palace and her high society luncheons. They had tried to steal my entire world to fund their greed, and in the process they had completely annihilated their own futures. The article also included a short paragraph about Dr. Keller. The State Medical Licensing Board had moved with terrifying speed after receiving my encrypted email containing the bribery contract. They did not just suspend his practice. They permanently revoked his medical license and handed his files directly over to the state attorney general. He was currently facing his own set of severe criminal charges for medical malpractice and accepting corporate bribes. His lucrative clinic downtown was permanently shuttered, its glass doors locked and covered in heavy chains. The arrogant physician, who had eagerly diagnosed me with a terminal mental decline, was now financially ruined and publicly disgraced. Justice had moved through my life like a violent cleansing storm, leaving nothing but the absolute truth in its wake. I picked up my ceramic coffee mug and walked to the back door. I turned the brass knob and stepped out onto the wide wooden porch. The morning sun was just beginning to crest over the distant tree line, casting long, beautiful beams of golden light across my property. I leaned against the wooden railing and looked down toward the lower pasture. It was the exact same piece of land where the arrogant corporate surveyor had parked his luxury vehicle 6 months ago. He had shown me digital blueprints of massive gray concrete warehouses that would have completely swallowed my farm and paved over my entire legacy. Those warehouses were never built. The multi-million-dollar contract was shredded into dust, and the logistics company had completely abandoned their development plans the very second they realized the federal government was involved. But the land was not empty. I watched a team of local landscapers and construction workers moving carefully across the soft earth. I had not sold the land, and I never would. The 50 acres were still securely locked inside the impenetrable legal vault of the South Dakota Blind Trust. However, as the primary beneficiary of that trust, I had the absolute right to dictate how the property was utilized. I had directed my attorney, Simon, to draft a very specific long-term lease agreement. I leased the back 20 acres of the lower pasture to a highly respected non-profit organization. They were a charity dedicated to building fully accessible tiny homes for disabled military veterans who were struggling to transition back into civilian life. I stood on the porch and watched the wooden frames of the new houses beginning to rise against the horizon. They were small, modest structures built with care and deep respect. They were not monuments to corporate greed or endless wealth. They were genuine sanctuaries for men and women who had actually sacrificed something real for their country. The organization was planting community gardens, building wheelchair-accessible walking paths, and creating a quiet, peaceful village where these heroes could heal. I watched a young veteran missing his left leg maneuvering his wheelchair along the newly paved gravel path, admiring the wooden frame of what would soon be his permanent home. A profound sense of pride swelled inside my chest. Matthew had looked at this land and seen nothing but a massive dollar sign. He saw a resource to be exploited so he could buy expensive cars and marble countertops. I looked at this land and saw a foundation for genuine human dignity. I had taken the very weapon they tried to use against me, my vast estate, and turned it into an instrument of absolute good. I took a deep, slow breath, letting the crisp morning air fill my lungs completely. The air tasted sweet and entirely free. I looked around the quiet expanse of my farm. For 6 agonizing months, the silence in my home had been a terrifying weapon. It had been a heavy, suffocating blanket used to isolate me, confuse me, and convince me that my mind was slowly dying. Matthew and Megan had weaponized my solitude, using the quiet moments to sneak into my sanctuary and plant their poison. But that toxic silence was completely gone. The silence that surrounded me now was entirely different. It was the sound of absolute, undeniable peace. It was the quiet, steady rhythm of a life lived with honor and protected by unyielding truth. I had learned the most painful lesson a father could ever learn. I learned that true family is not automatically defined by shared blood or a common last name. Blood can be toxic. Blood can be greedy. True family is defined by mutual respect, genuine loyalty, and a love that never seeks to exploit or destroy. I had lost a son to his own monstrous greed, but I had saved my own life and protected the legacy I had built with the woman I truly loved. I took a final sip of my warm coffee, feeling the heat spread through my chest. I set the empty mug down on the wooden railing. I stepped off the porch and began to walk down the gentle, grassy slope toward the lower pasture. I wanted to go down and introduce myself to the young veteran in the wheelchair. I wanted to welcome him to the neighborhood. I walked away from the shadows of the farmhouse and stepped fully into the bright, warm light of the morning sun. My mind was sharp, my heart was steady, and my future was finally my own again. If you found value in my journey, please let me know which city you are listening from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe that the truth always finds a way to step out of the darkness and into the light. Thank you for walking this difficult path with me. Your support means the world. I look forward to reading your thoughts, and I will see you in the next life story.